next paper is titled Gender and Accessibility in Rwanda and Malawi and is being presented by Joyojeet Pal.
Hello? Yep. Okay. Hi. So I have the pleasure of standing between you and your afternoon nap. I'll start off by telling you a small story. Happened with me, I think, about maybe something like 10 years ago. Back then, I'm pretty sure, working at MSR Labs in India. And this one day, I was driving in a car which was stopped at a traffic light. And it was stopped at a traffic light, and at that time, it was Indian traffic where basically nothing's moving. And there was this lady who walked through the traffic light with a man. Man was blind, and the man would be on her arm, and she would walk with him and knock on windows of cars and ask for money. And she had this remarkable ability that as somebody opened their window, no matter where it was, she could immediately spot it and move straight there with this gentleman. So he was blind, she was guiding him around, and they were this is how they made their living. So I was in this car, and I pulled the window down. And immediately she saw me, and she moved towards the car, and she came to the car, and then I handed him some money. So I hand him the money, and right after I hand him the money, he stands there with his hands like this, like in a blessing almost, right at my face. And I'm a little bit thrown off by this incident. I'm kind of waiting there, and his hand is still there right by my face. And I'm wondering what to do next. And at that point, he says, AC. And this incident really made me think about it later on, is that obviously there was so much going on. This gentleman was actually fairly well dressed, and here he was, and this was how he was making his living. But was there a gendered element to it, which is that if we had switched around, that if it was the female who was blind and a male person taking taking her around, would that have been different? And I argue that it would have been different because of the nature of how gender and disability is constructed, and therefore how gender and how disability and whose responsibility it is to take care of disability is constructed in India. So this is a good starting point for the study that we're doing. In this case, I'm presenting results from Malawi and Rwanda, but the study has been done in 6 countries around the world, in 6 cities rather around the world. Mumbai, then you're going to look at results here from Kigali and Blantyre and Zomba, which is one urban stretch, and also Sierra Leone, which Jasmine will talk about later, and San Jose in Costa Rica, and Seoul in South Korea, and we have reasons for why we selected those cities. What I'm going to talk about primarily is these 2 cities, and the countries here are Kigali, are Rwanda and Malawi. If you can look at them on the map, basically they share a border with Tanzania. Both countries are landlocked and heavily smallholder agrarian. So about 80+% in both countries are engaged in some kind of agricultural work, but less than 30% of GDP in both countries is agriculture related. They do have some important distinctions. Rwanda has had a significant post-war growth period, and what's also important, it's had primarily a single party rule, a single leader rule, pretty much. There's been significant effort around gender in government, primarily at the top level. Rwanda has had, for a while, the highest number of females in government, and Malawi is different in one important way, which is of a very high HIV prevalence. This study was a mixed method study. Like I said, it was part of a 6-country study. We did in these 2 cities, 76 surveys, and in addition to the surveys were basically looking at individuals and to what extent their independence, as well as several other factors like social participation, economic access, was changed by access to mobile devices, in addition to which we're looking at what kinds of devices they're using, how much time are they spending on them, what are they doing while they're on them, and so on and so forth. And additionally, we have 20 in-depth qualitative interviews, 10 each in each country. And what I'm going to do in this talk is primarily talk about that. My purpose here, rather than come up with a set of very core findings, is to get you interested in the subject and think of a different way of approaching the questions around accessibility and social mobility in these two cities. So why accessibility and gender? The general idea that we were very interested in when we started this research was to look at the intersectionality. So you have poverty as one factor and disability as an additional factor in terms of your marginalization in society. And as we were looking at the research results from these two cities in particular, gender emerged as a very important factor which kept being repeated over and over again. Now, the next study that you're going to hear about is from Sierra Leone, where the theme was overwhelmingly about the war, which makes them two very distinct studies. In these two places, the gender and accessibility was an important piece. What we are also very aware of as people working in the space is that our work is frequently at the intersection of documenting technology for things like the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because both countries are in the process of upgrading facilities for people with disabilities, which is one of the guiding factors behind the work that we're doing. Now, in our findings, and here again, I thought a lot about how to discuss findings around the subject, and when we did the interviews, the people who we were doing interviews with thought of us as those who will tell their stories. And so the way that I've arranged the slides here is also very much around that. So the first slide is around the idea of social membership. And the person here says, say a woman is supposed to attend a funeral, but a blind woman is timid of going there because they say, even if you can go there, you can't do some chores there because during the funeral services, so they just leave them behind. The point behind this is that, for instance, in Malawi, funeral services are a very important part of your social participation. Who should have a cell phone? If the individual is likely to be excluded even from very basic family issues, are they likely to have the agency to be able to purchase the devices that they need to be able to participate in society? The second issue is that of information asymmetry. What I have here is, if a seller asks them, this is talking about women, that a brand of cell phone costs $4,000, they will be shy as to the response. They will give the $4,000. I know the average, and this is a man speaking, and what kinds of cell phones they have, but women, they simply can't deal with those things. With electronic devices, women are just, they can't do it. If I go to the store and I want to buy a cell phone, I will say I want a Nokia 8, and they bring it to me, and then I feel it and I say, yes, that is the brand that I want. What you're seeing here is an example of social networks and access. And what we noticed over and over again is that women paid more for cell phones than men. And one of the reasons for this is that women had much lesser access to social networks, especially used cell phones, than men, which they were able to get from their friends and so on and so forth. And in turn, women were much more likely also, therefore, to get their cell phones from showrooms instead of through gray markets where it's cheaper. The other part of this comes in the gifting issue. Women are always having to be kept hidden because that's how they were brought up. But there is this problem, the issue of having luxury items. Of course, some of the women, they will tell you that they bought their mobile devices. Well, actually, they didn't. Again, this is a man speaking. They got those as gifts. Men, on the other hand, men travel. They always get around, and They know how much X has bought it and Y has bought it and how much Z has paid, and they just have to make some kind of an average. What we're finding here is another example of the fact that women are seen as having information asymmetries, but we're also seeing something very different, is of a man othering the experience of a woman with a disability, such that the woman's experience with a disability is easier than a man's experience with a disability, because a woman would have access to gifts, which men don't. Men have to stand on their own feet, whether they have a disability or not. Love. And we were surprised at how many times some concept of love and relationships came up. In this case, this man is saying, I think at least if I was able to send messages on my own, at least love would really improve. You know what? Sometimes it happens that maybe you have a certain message you feel like sending, and it's something like a secret. You don't need to disclose it anyhow to any people, and I mean anybody. So if I was able to send a message on my own, I would be the very, very happiest person. One of the biggest advantages of mobile devices for people throughout the sample was the access to privacy, but also people rated very highly their access to social participation once they had access to mobile phones. Connecting. This is another man speaking. The boys that I know with VI, frequently referred to in vision impairment, and those who have good jobs are those who just go around and talk to so many people. And they met like in pubs and the bars, and they talked. And then later on, they could just find a job. But it would be a bit odd for a woman to just invite a man to a pub and talk. Sometimes people would have to think of it as though you're just selling yourself, as if you're just offering your body. Again, for women, there are a different set of rules of engagement and expectations of public behavior, which ties into both the social networks and how they would affect the ways people were able to buy devices, likewise extending to workplace networks and how women were able to access or not access workplace. Channeling, another important thing that we've talked about at several other cases. What we have in this quote, I'm not going to go through the entire quote, is a woman saying that as a woman with a vision impairment, she was excluded from nursing and from teaching, which are the two primary types of occupations that women are seen as having in Malawi, in Rwanda. And therefore, she was taken away from having access to that. Now, the reason why this becomes important is that with the lack of access to assistive technologies, that means that a large number of digital sector jobs are out of reach of individuals, and therefore, the channeling effects of what women are expected to do in society can be even more extreme. At the home and the world, again, this is a man speaking, sometimes you could just go and apply for a job. If you include it in your CV, in your application letter, you can just say you can use the new technology, but they simply won't believe you. They'll always keep asking themselves, this is a woman talking, how is she going to do it? How does she proceed? And where are you going to get the technology? The challenge with having access to assistive technology, this was true across not just these two sites, but every other site that we looked at, is that employers don't want to buy assistive technology for people at the workplace. Often what they have to do is they have to do trial versions of the typical software such as JAWS, which stops after every 35 minutes. After every 35 minutes, after which you need to restart the machine. So if you're working on a network, for instance, then that means everybody else on the network needs to restart. So that happens to be the typical operating environment for somebody who can't have, say, $1,000 to put down on software for their new employee. And the last point is this, which comes from a man, is women are shy, they don't like walking. Again, if you look back at the other point about othering of females' experiences with disability, they think that they can be laughed at if they fall in a pit somewhere. But men, they can't care. They don't care. And what it is to fail in a public space. And for men who have disabilities, who are out in public spaces and dealing with the experiences of falling in public spaces, the perception of what it is to fail is very different from that of what a woman's might be, and therefore, that brings in another complexity of how far you are expected to be restricted to the home, especially when your public spaces are not incredibly accessible. So, this is my last slide. As we did this research, we found that there was far more in common between the women in Kigali and the women in Blantyre than there were between males and females in the cities themselves. And that was the first reason to think about the gender and accessibility as a major point. What we're trying to think about as a major direction of work going ahead is of accessibility infrastructure as a broader set of services within which accessibility works. It is not sufficient to think of accessibility simply as the tool in your hand, as a mobile device which allows you to get access to digital text or what have you, but to think about whether there's a community around you which supports it. And there is a lot of research, for instance, in organizational theory about what technologies have succeeded and what have failed, not based on whether or not they were necessarily the best technologies at a given point of time, but whether or not there was a community around them to support them. For instance, with people with disabilities, there is an incredible continuation of technologies which are 5, 6, 7 years behind what a smartphone will allow you to do. But because you've learned to use a Nokia N-series phone with a screen reader, and you feel that that is what the rest of your community is using, you end up continuing to have to use that technology. Essentially, what I've made a point with all of these, which is the 3 topics which I've addressed through these themes, is that there are gendered publics, unwilling workplaces, and the question of individual agency in the way that women have access to public space, which impact the way accessibility takes place. The point of this talk was to think of this as a way of approaching accessibility. If you're going to design for accessibility, we encourage you to read up on the ways accessibility is actually situated in the lives of people, and not necessarily just to think of it as a framework of design. The bigger point is that I am thinking of mobiles increasingly as a public good for people with disabilities, especially because at the heart of what we're seeing here is that the state and the infrastructure of the state does not necessarily work for individuals with disabilities. As a result, you're looking at mobiles and technologies replacing that. Whether that's a good thing or not, that's open to discussion. So, questions?
So we have time for about nine minutes worth of questions.
Oh, I should have gone over.
No, that's good. Supposed to have 10 minutes.
So that's an excellent talk, Joyojeet. Thank you. My question is, how accurate do you think the men's view was of women's use of technology?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Richard, for calling my presentation an excellent presentation. One of the points that I'm trying to make here is that there is actually very limited exchange between men with disabilities and women with disabilities. So there is this sense of othering that men will say that women with disabilities are getting fancy phones donated to them. But if you look at the sample of what phones they have, the women have basically the really low-end cheap phones. But there is this perception among the men with disabilities that women have it much better than us. And you should, as researchers, among other things, be looking at our problems rather than thinking about what women have to do, because after all, they are being taken care of by the men in their families. So the short answer to that is that they're likely very misplaced, and in large part because there isn't a space for interaction for people with disabilities in places where there aren't institutions after, say, you go to a blind school, you finish with a blind school, and then you're out. Then what? There is no social network. You are then back in your home. That is, if you ended up going to the blind school at all and not interacting in multiple ways. Yes, Ed. And then I have 1, 2 here.
Well, just quickly to follow up on that, do you think that this distinction or this mismatch between the men's view of the women, or the lack of speaking is really that different for the visually impaired and the general population of men and women?
That's a great question. And probably there are many ways in which this is not very different from gendered perspectives of looking at the other, right? But in this case, I highlighted it because it was so specifically different from what the data showed us. The data showed us that the phones are the same. In fact, the women have much weaker phones in terms of their processing capability, but the men seem to think that the women have better phones. But the women do pay more for even the lesser phones. There was a hand there. Yes, please.
Thank you. I want to congratulate you for bringing up this topic because it's something I haven't heard a lot about in the first couple days of this conference. And GSMA just came out with a survey that showed that there is this very gendered aspect to access to mobile technology. And my own research is with refugees, and I've been trying to do very similar surveys with refugee communities about mobile ICT access. And it has been such a struggle. When I call a focus group, 10 men show up, 3 women show up, and the only way I've been able to actually really engage with the female communities is to ask specifically at the end to bring the women into a separate room, and as a woman, speaking to a woman, I've been able to talk about some of these access issues, I feel like, in a very frank manner. Can you talk a little about your methodology and how you went about that?
Yes, so we had the same problem. We had to snowball. Okay, so first up, this research, you have to work through networks. If you're looking for, we were in Kigali, we were at the point where everybody who had a vision impairment and had a cell phone knew about us. Because, oh yeah, we've already done your interview. It was kind of like that, where you actually have to push yourself to find, okay, is there another person, is there another person? And then also, if you're looking at doing qualitative research of this kind, in our case, we had a female interviewer in one situation, and she went to the homes of actually in every interview, we went to the homes wherever possible of individuals and tried to interview them there. Now, in both cases, the interviews were done in local languages, and that was a big advantage. But my short advice to you would be that you really need to spend some time gaining access to the community and getting their buy-in. In both cases, there were also organizations which worked with people with disabilities, which were DPOs, disabled persons organizations themselves, which were able to enable this. But now we're looking at samples of 5 and 5 women. If I had to do a much larger study, what you're pointing out as a challenge would be way more difficult for me to find, say, 40 female respondents to this study. So I completely see your problem here. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
Hi. I was wondering about the schools for visually impaired. So did you go down to the level of children, and then are those schools serving as a vehicle for adoption of newer technologies?
No, we didn't go down to people to schools. The schools in both these sites were not vehicles for adoption of technology. In fact, Jasmine will tell you more about the Sierra Leonean case, where it is often the case that screen readers, which were common in all our 3 other, the Asian and Latin American sites, are usually used by somebody who's actually sitting and typing on a computer and reading out, a sighted person working between themselves and the individual. So in both Rwanda and Malawi, the phones were overwhelmingly, I think like 72 of the 76 phones were just basic feature phones. So this is the first generation of people in both these cities which have ever used any kind of assistive technology. So it's very difficult to compare them from this side to something which is more, say, American, where schools are a segue into assistive technology, and you're aware of some kinds of assistive technology as, say, an employer. Whereas in these sites, if you tell an employer that this is a blind person who can use a computer, it's just bizarre.
Hello.
Yes.
My name is Amos. I want to find out what was peculiar with the visually impaired you sampled on the issue of accessibility, different from what we know in the general public as men having more accessibility compared to women? And also, was the mobile phones being used by the visually impaired a specialized one? And how easy is it for them to be able to use that? Thank you.
So typically, I got the second question. I didn't get the first one, but let me answer the second question and I'll come back to the first one. So only 4 of the devices which were used in this case were very advanced, what we would think of as multi-purpose devices. Most of the devices were general devices like your Nokia 1000 series type phone, which is used for basic texting and voice. So that's the second question. That said, if you're asking, are they difficult to learn? There is a learning curve with if you're a person who has never used an assistive device before. And the reason why your question is very interesting is that that learning curve also often means that the extent to which you become tied to that technology is also very significant. Because you've never had anything which allows you access to digital text before. You've always been dependent on another human person. And suddenly you can do all of it on a mobile device and do things like record lectures, et cetera, et cetera. So once you have that first device, moving from the first device to the second device is itself a big challenge, because you don't want to give up this thing that you know that you have that you've just never had before. So I don't know if I'm out of time, but
We have one more question.
The first question was if accessibility in the general sense between men and women is higher with men having accessibility.
Yes,
but
the short
is
answer.
it that intense with the visually impaired or different?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Males have much higher likelihood of even having access to accessible technology and even access to the disabled persons organizations. So if you go to a disabled persons organization in either city, you will find that they have way more men and a couple of females. So, thank you.
So, no questions?
One more question.
Okay.
Jonathan, sorry, no.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So Joyojeet Pal being Joyojeet Pal, here.
Hey.
What aspect of your arguments, however eloquent made, can you actually say with confidence is going to be correct? And what aspects are qualitative that they are your personal judgment calls? Because you come up with fairly strong assessments of you believe the world looks like this. So what is ground truth and what should be taken with a bucket of salt?
So I think you're asking like a deeper question about method and whether we as people who are doing work with small samples of people, fundamentally, you can't find a large sample of people who have this kind of access, or whether that kind of research is legitimate or not is fundamentally at heart the question you're asking me. I would say it is legitimate, because to think about what are the questions you need to think to build quantifiable research, you need to understand the nature of one's condition, of living through a condition of having inaccessible infrastructure on a day and night basis. And that kind of question you cannot get simply by trying to put a number to it. I agree that I am making certain assertions, and not only am I making certain assertions, I am choosing which assertions I am trying to make or not. So I am biasing you by putting through what I'm saying. But it is qualitative research, and that's the nature of qualitative research. It's a narrative. It tells you about a certain condition rather than prove or disprove something.
Thank you, Joyojeet. That was worth